Hello and welcome to the Business and Banking Dialogue Show. Ladies and gentlemen, monetization of public assets is the word these days. By unlocking the value of underutilized or unutilized public assets, asset monetization creates new sources of revenue for the many assets owned by public sector are optimally utilized or vacant or barren, and hence have failed to yield adequate return. Monetization of unutilized public assets, which has been an option until now, will to financial resources for the PSBs, and in the long term will lead to efficient utilization of and Banking Dialogue Show, ladies and gentlemen. To discuss changing PSBs, emerging and privatizing, which is the about much in the budget of have with us to discuss on the topic of change role of public banks in the emerging era of privatization. Hello, Ms. Latha.
Yeah, tell me.
Yeah, sorry. I said welcome to the show. I thought I lost
thank you, because I think there was a voice problem. Thank you so much.
Yeah. Okay. So, ma'am, in one of the recent public address, PM said that government has no business to be in business. It's a great saying that he said so, and that is quite audacious, I would say. This is a major deviation from the past. The PM even recognized the role of private enterprises. How important is private enterprise in your view for Atmanirbhar Bharat and for the 5 trillion economy?
So it's a well-said statement by the Honorable Prime Minister that the government has no business to be in business. But then the government is always in business. It's not that business means only the private sector enterprise or the public sector enterprises. Frankly speaking, yes, there is a lot of importance which the private sector enterprises have in the Atmanirbhar Bharat. Because nothing can be done exclusively by the public sector enterprise or by the private sector enterprises. Both have to go hand in hand if they really want to make India absolutely a self-sufficient, and as the idea of the Honorable Prime Minister is that we should really be Atmanirbhar. I think each and every individual in each and every private enterprises has to participate in it, in whichever way it is. And if you see that there is no reason why the private sector enterprises cannot be a part of the all-inclusive growth in the country. Any growth in the country has to be basically by the private sector enterprises. Public sector enterprises, see, maybe in a few domains like banking or the insurance or the defense or some such other power. Other than that, everything else is in the private sector enterprises only. And they have to play, like the MSMEs. They have a major role to play in the Atmanirbhar. How they do it is a matter of choice. The only problem, again, I feel that private sector enterprises in the Atmanirbhar Bharat is, though we have the capability, though we have the skill, though we have the digitalization, the quality control, which is really required for export, especially by an MSME unit, is not really up to the mark. We do not do the last mile conversion of really having a good quality in order to ensure that my product is able to withstand the quality control, that my product which I am exporting is internationally or globally, it will be able to withstand any kind of test. This is where I think we have to improve upon. But other than that, the private enterprises have a very, very major role to play in the Atmanirbhar. Of course, the public sector enterprises, which as of today is mostly into the banking or the insurance, will be able to help the private sector enterprises to come up. But without the private sector enterprises, let's all understand that Atmanirbhar Bharat is not going to happen. And what the Honorable Prime Minister said is that the government should be not in the business of really interfering. Basically, I think what he means to say is we made a statement that the moment the government comes into the business, they are not able to really do a competitive business because of too much of control, too much of bureaucracy, and too much of fear that there will be an accountability on the concerned person. From that aspect, yes, definitely the private sector enterprises are more viable. They have the flexibility, they have the capacity, they have the capability, and I think they will definitely be one of the major milestones or the major, I should say, the conduit for the government to depend on for making our country an Atmanirbhar Bharat.
It's one very important aspect of quality control. I think, that's where I think the private enterprise should also focus on the quality of the product. If they have to be world class, we are just not there. Let's be frank about it. Quality suffers, and I think what you said is very important. In your, when you were at the bank, and have you come across major problems with other countries who are saying that the people whom you are giving credit or line of credit, their quality is not good? Or have you come across, or have you seen some issues with it?
Yeah, this is a problem with many companies. If you see, even, I'd not like to take names, but one of the major exporters of textile, I don't know whether people remember, about 3 to 4 years back, the US government had a major issue saying that you had mentioned they were all Egyptian cotton, whereas they were not 100% Egyptian cotton. Yeah. Even major companies. Though it was said that it was by their rival competitor, whatever it is. And many of our exports, if you see, get rejected finally because they find that it is not up to the standard at which they were really booked. The orders were booked. So that is a major issue for our country. And that is one of the major reasons, if you see, that the foreign countries, the exporters, when they want to take it from us, that is their importers and our exporters, they come to India, do a quality check. Because we have, if you see, states like Tamil Nadu with Tirupur as one of the, they used to say it's a Manchester of India. We had a problem because we were not able to do the zero pollution. See, internationally, you have to have these kind of, not only quality control, you have to be very strict with your labor laws. You can't have child labor. See, there are so many issues. Once you are able to manage all these issues, I think India has the best potential for exports, and the private sector enterprises, the medium sector enterprises can really change the contour of our country's growth.
Okay, thank you. We'll touch upon the labor laws reforms a little later. Government has made up its mind, to monetize, been already declared. In this era of impending privatization, only talking about banks, public sector banks are expected to remain possible. The key.
Your voice is not coming through, Mr. KK.
Voice is not coming through?
No.
Okay. So my question to you is, ma'am, is what would be the key considerations that should be kept in mind while select the banks will operate competing with private banks and higher standard of efficiency?
Okay. First and foremost, I think it will not be only 4 banks which will remain in the public sector, to the best of my knowledge. What the government, I think, has said is that they would like to have a minimum operations in 4 major sectors, like banking, insurance, financial services, etc. It's not 4 banks. Because if you see the Honorable Finance Minister, she has made a statement that we need 10 big banks like a State Bank of India. And I think that was one of the major reasons why about 10 banks were merged and 4 banks were made in that process. So maybe ultimately they may have 4 public sector banks and others can be private sector banks. There is no such reasons for that. There is a lot of things which I think the public sector banks have to now do in order to compete more with the private sector banks. Because if you see just a couple of days back or 3 days back, the government has even opened up that even the government accounts can be taken over by the private sector banks.
Private sector, yes.
Earlier, the public sector banks generally had a monopoly on these, defense accounts or the army accounts and all that. Now, the private sector banks will be able to do it. Now, the advantage a private sector bank has is it's a much leaner organization because they have the competence. They are able to give better customer service as of today. Not all of them, I agree, but some of them are able to give customer service. So in order to overcome this, the public sector banks, of course, the government has to help a lot in this. Unless the government helps in this, the public sector banks cannot overnight change themselves. The government, if they give them the leeway, then the public sector banks have to change their attitude of ensuring that they also are able to give better customer service. They improve their infrastructure. They start ensuring that the ambience and the overall presence of themselves all over the country is definitely improved. See, the advantage which a private sector organization or a private sector bank has vis-a-vis a public sector bank is that the private sectors are not forced to do kinds of loans. I wouldn't say forced, but I would say are not asked to do those kind of loans like your mudra loans and all the government sponsored schemes. They do it. It's not that they don't do it, but they can do the pick and choose.
Yes.
Whereas the public sector banks have no choice. They are given a target and everybody has to achieve a target. Secondly, if the public sector bank has to improve, they have to ensure that their quality of assets which they are doing has to really improve. Because today, if you see the advantage which a private sector bank has over a public sector bank is in the ratio of the NPAs, the asset quality. Asset quality, see, one of the reasons I think the government also says we don't want to be in the business of business is because, they are funding more and more and still the asset quality does not seem to be improving in the public sector banks.
Yeah.
And post-pandemic, we really do not know what is going to be the level at which the asset quality is going to remain. Though we had one kind of a cleaning in the year 2015-16, but still the percentage of assets which are not really very healthy or very high level. These are all a matter of concern. So the public sector banks, in order to overcome these things, have to refurbish themselves. Like you completely do a branch office or you completely do a head office, they have to do internally in all kinds of aspects, including their manpower training, including their manpower recruitment. Only then they will be in a position to really take on heads-on with the private sector enterprises, right from digitalization, right from the manpower. I would say the most important thing, the human resources in a public sector undertaking has the attitude that once I get a job, I am there forever. There is no question of him saying that, I can get thrown out. So naturally, the responsibility is not there. Whereas if you see a private sector enterprise, even if you tell a customer, if you tell a banker who calls you whether for a credit card or whatever it is, I'm not interested, he'll keep calling you up 10 times to the extent that you'll go and tell him, okay, Baba, you take it from me. Whereas a public sector employee generally does not do it because he feels, okay, wow, how does it matter to me whether it comes to me or it doesn't come to me?
Yeah.
Because we do not have that performance-linked incentive as yet. Though the government has been talking of introducing the performance-linked incentive for the human resources, we do not have that. So these are some of the aspects where the public sector bank has to really, it's a top level which has to really, sit on the boardroom. They have to have a lot of discussion and they have to really change the attitude. They have to change the entire perspective of the thinking. The mindset has to change. I'm not saying private sector banks are gung-ho, frankly speaking. They also have a lot of issues, no doubt on that. But in the present scenario, the public sector banks already have taken a beating. And unless we change our mindset as a public sector bank, they will be losing more and more business to the private sector banks. Because the government announcing that they can take over the private account, all the public accounts, and they don't have to, restrict their salary. They don't have to restrict the recruitments. Whereas as a public sector, it's restricted at the entry level, it's restricted at the promotion level. All these things, the government has to permit the public sector banks to do it. And the public sector banks in turn also has to take up with the government that we also should be given the liberty and the freedom not to be guided only by certain restrictions, that we should have only this percentage of top level management, this level of, because in the public sector there are guidelines that if you have this many crores of business, you can have 1 GM or 2 GMs or 3 GMs. And if you have 1 GM, you can have 3 DGMs, and if you have 3 DGMs, you have 9 AGMs. This kind of a thing is not going to work out anymore. It may be an organization, I need less GMs and more DGMs.
Yeah.
That discretion should be given to the board, number one. Number two, I don't know, you may be asking me this later also, but I'm telling you again, the advantage for a private sector enterprise is that he has a right to choose his MD and CEO. He has a right to choose his top management. In a public sector enterprise, unfortunately, he or she comes from another organization with a tenure of 2 to 3 years. This really, I'm telling you, hampers the growth of a public sector organization, because the 2 or 3 years, no person who has come from another organization can understand the nuances of the organization which is taking over and run the organization. And especially if he comes from a smaller organization to a bigger organization, the chances of it are much more difficult for him to understand. And this is one of the reasons you find that many organizations, public sector organizations, have this problem. Because by the time he really settled down, it is time for him to leave the organization.
Yeah.
And the new person comes.
Correct.
So these are some of the challenges.
As also the number of years that he may have left before he retires.
That's okay.
Maybe
2
1
years
or 2
years. Yeah. 2 years or 3 years. And he is never from the same organization. See, if he's at least from the same organization, even if he has 3 years, he knows his organization in and out. So at least the 3 years which is there in the organization continue. But he comes from a completely different organization, from a much smaller organization. And when he tries to run a bank of a huge size, see, again, there will be a clashes between the senior management, and clashes in the sense, the feeling is always there that someone else is coming and trying to lord over me. These kind of things have to change if they really want the public sector banks also to perform well.
Thank you. Thank you. So, ladies and gentlemen, this is a very interesting topic and something that, you all may be having a lot of queries and questions to ask, ma'am. So please put in your questions in the chat box, in the Q&A box, and we will try to get it across to ma'am as early as possible. Should you wish to ask a question directly to her, you could do that. Raise your hand and the digital team will get you across. So look forward to your questions soon rather than later. Ma'am, would this, from what we are seeing and what is the new thought that is coming from the government and the push that's happening, would we say that is it the end of road for PSBs? Because they have been the growth, they have been engines of growth during the last 70 years. I mean, there is no doubt their role has been recognized. But times change, things change, and nothing what was earlier as 70 years should continue for the next 70 years. There's no rule. So do you think with the push of privatization, it's the end of road for PSBs?
I really don't agree with that.
Okay.
Because, see, you tell me one thing, in the private sector banks also, you have a couple of black sheep who have not been able to perform well. The only thing, the public sector banks have to be given the liberty. Once you give them the liberty and you allow them to be run professionally, see, if you see the committees which have already recommended, have already said that you bring your stake to less than 50%. Once you bring your stake to less than 50%, and allow the organization to be run on a professional basis with certain structural reforms, I think a public sector bank can definitely do much more than a private sector bank. For the simple reason that, see, you have to have that financial inclusion.
Yeah.
But for a public sector bank, everybody, no, a private sector bank can do that kind of financial inclusion as that of a public sector bank. And if you want the country to grow, it has to be that each and every individual should be able to access a bank account, should be able to have a decent standard of living. And for all this, the financial sectors, whether it's a banking or the insurance or the health sector, will have to provide. The private sector, let's be very honest, is more interested in the profit making. It's but natural. I mean, as an individual or as a banker, if I'm a private bank, my target is going to be more on the profit making rather than on the social inclusion. Whereas as a public sector undertaking, because the government involvement is also there, but I'm saying let it bring down to 49% or 50%, they will be ensuring that each and every individual, to the best possible extent, is included in the financial system. In fact, if you see, it's only in the last 7 to 8 years that once you started having these mudra accounts, and once you have the Jan Dhan Yojana account, that was really a boon for the absolute poor people, that during the pandemic, the entire DBT was able to be transferred to them.
Absolutely.
But for it, otherwise they would not be able to get the money, and it used to go to the middleman, and from the middleman, you don't even know whether they really get the money. So the question of public sector bank, forget next 70 years, I think even next 100 years will be there. But yes, the contours and the way of doing the things, there has to be a drastic change. They have to be more, what should I say, trim. They have to be more flexible. And the attitude should be that I have to perform or I'll perish.
Yes.
That should not be there anymore, that whether you perform or not, you will continue to get the government capitalization of funds. No. You perform and or perish. If you perform, you will continue. If you otherwise, you have to perish. Like the government has already decided some 2 banks will get privatized or whatever it is. The other banks will also go the same way. But no way that the public sector banks can be out of this country, and it should not be, because keeping the social and the economic welfare of the country, public sector banks have a huge role to play. Number one. Number two, see, how many people can lend huge amounts also?
Yes.
Private sector bank cannot lend that kind of lending which is required in the country. A few, maybe you may not have so many banks, but a few top banks, maybe as the Honorable Finance Minister said, 10 banks, like to the size of State Bank of India. And you know, the 10 banks have been merged to 4 banks. All these put together can continue with definitely improvements, and they're definitely much more sustainable, I would say, than a private sector.
Okay. Is it 2 banks or 4 banks are in the news for privatization?
No, the Honorable Finance Minister said as of now 2 banks other than IDBI.
Okay.
As of now 2 banks. Others will come in the play maybe.
Okay. Because we noticed that 4 banks scripts are on the rise in the stock exchange.
Exactly, because nobody knows which are the 2 banks which are going to get.
Yeah. So I thought it was already declared, you know.
No, okay. No, not as yet.
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, I look forward to your questions. Ma'am, what is the government's agenda for harnessing the private sector bank, towards for rapid infrastructure growth of international scale and standards?
Yeah, see, if you see, there's already a fund which has been formed as IIFF fund, in which the government has 49%, and the other major banks like ICICI, Axis Bank, HDFC, Kotak Life Insurance, all of them have substantial percentage, including the Singapore Temasek has invested in that. So they will definitely be involved in the infrastructure funding. Because today, if you see, the government has already announced huge amount of funding for the infrastructure. And that is a must, because unless the infrastructure improves, the economy of the country, and which we are planning to take it to a 5 trillion economy, cannot really take place unless the infrastructure improves. And infrastructure not only means roads, it means the power, it means the port, it means the airlines. And if you see, the government has already handed over most of the airports to the private sector enterprises.
Yes.
Hardly any, I think one or two may be still there, or a few may be still there where it's been handled by the government organization of the Airports Authority of India or something. As late as the latest one, even in Kerala, has been handed over to the private sector organizations only.
Yeah.
Similarly, if you see infrastructure, the private sectors, especially in tier 2 and tier 3 cities, have started to come up with the low income group housing and affordable housing and etc. And if you see your freight corridor, which is going to start, is basically mostly by the, which has already started in certain things, and is also going to continue to start in a few more places, is basically by the private sector. And I think even your trains, they are planning to give it to the private sectors. The bullet train, which has been planning to be implemented, will be by the private sector. So a lot of infrastructure fundings are there, which not only the private banks, public sector banks, the private enterprises will have to fund it in order to do it. We'll have a lot of, I think, even international funding coming in, because today, if you see, a lot of liquidity in the international market.
Yes.
So they would like to definitely come to India so that they get a better return. And I think all that will really help in the infrastructure funding of our country.
Okay, yeah. So I think what you say about the infrastructure is so important. That's one area which needs tremendous growth. And that in itself will kind of accelerate our growth in other sectors, right? Okay.
Exactly.
Sorry. Let's take a call. Let's take an audience call. Harish Prabhu has raised his hand and he would like to ask a question. Harish Prabhu is a frequent visitor to this and he's a very experienced banker. Okay, Prabhu, go ahead.
Yeah, good afternoon, ma'am.
Good afternoon.
Yeah. See, in case of LVB, while it was a private bank, when it was given to DBS, the shareholders, the bondholders, were technically given a full tonsure by the Reserve Bank of India, right?
Right.
Now, obviously, this is in litigation, and the process followed was to, the process that is going to be followed for the privatization of the two banks is going to be through a bidding process which values the banks on the future potential of the business, right? Like a discounted cash flow basis.
Right.
Now, be that as may, given whatever the level of NPAs or what have you, which the new owner has to plug the hole, but the underlying value of the any public sector bank, one of these two public sector banks, if you strip it down to its asset value, real estate, blah blah blah, and all, brand, will be probably much more than the valuing the bank on a future discounting of future cash flows, right? So what is to say that if this process is followed, and it might go back into litigation like the same way LVB has gone, so do you have any thoughts on how the privatization of these two public sector banks would have to be conducted, because it's going to be a much tougher call than LVB. This is my surmise.
Yes, Mr. Harish, I fully agree with you, because the government has not really come out with the guidelines as to what is going to be the methodology in which they are going to go in for the privatization of the two banks. In fact, they have not even decided which are the two banks.
Yeah.
Mr. KK is saying there are 4 bank scripts which are going up. But nowhere have they said whether it is going to be a big bank which is going to get privatized or whether it's going to be one of the weaker banks. There's a possibility it can be, if there are two aspects to it. Whether the government wants to stop recapitalization of banks because they are weak and they don't want to keep on pumping more and more money into the banks, then they will be definitely selling off a weaker bank. But if the attitude is that we don't want to interfere anymore, as Mr. KK was feeling that in a few years' time, the public sector banks will not have much of a say in the system, then they may even go for a bigger bank. As of today, nobody has an idea which bank is going to be sold, though the market is all agog as to which banks, because they feel that since 4 banks have been merged, 10 banks have been merged to 4 big banks, so those 4 big banks may not be touched. and the balance 5 or 6 banks which have not been merged may be touched. Secondly, as far as LVB to DBS is concerned, this is my view again. See, people may say there are assets or whatever it is, but actually, if you see where was the capital adequacy in that, it was a net negative account. In fact, the person who was taken over, DBS, we don't even know how many more skeletons are there in the cupboard. See, a person who is going to take over a weak public sector bank also has to keep in mind what are going to be the skeletons in the cupboard, number one. Number two, we'll also have to understand one more thing is a person who takes over a weak public sector bank, he may think I'll get a lot of this liability benefit, liability in the sense the deposits. But once the depositor knows it is taken over by a private bank, he or she may shift his or her account to a public sector bank. So the chances of the person who is taking over is not going to be that easy, because today, you tell me one thing, Mr. Harish, when I'm able to get a fresh bank license on tap, why should I go and break my head with an account with a bank, which is a weak bank? Secondly, being a government bank, I cannot even remove the staff. I will have to perforce keep the staff. I do not know what is the quality of the staff in that bank. So I think these are a lot of issues are there. I mean, the government has announced it, no doubt, but I think even after the amendments come through from the Reserve Bank of India, because they have to do the 2 amendments for allowing this. But I think that, as you say, there is a lot of nitty-gritty which they have to really work at, because what is going to be the actual benefit the government is going to get? Because most of these public sector banks, I mean, again, let me tell you, Mr. Harish, very few of them have non-core assets, frankly speaking. Because see, non-core assets will be how much? Maximum maybe, say 500 crores or 1,000 crores, not more than that. But you'll have a corresponding liability on that also. So, but unless they come out with the nitty-gritty, it is very difficult, because we really do not know whether they are going to sell off based on their market capitalization, or whether they are going to sell it as on the future cash flow or on the net present value. The government has not really come out the modus operandi on which they plan to dilute the stake, or whether it is going to be out and out 100% to 1%, because as of today, you cannot have more than 15% holding an individual. So then the other option, Mr. Harish, is like LVB was merged with DBS, whether these public sector banks will get merged with some other private bank, which again may not work out so easily, because merging it either with ICA, because only 2-3 banks can take over such banks, is either ICICI, HDFC, or Axis or Kotak. So whether they will be really interested in taking it over is again a matter of, the choice. So I think we have to wait. I really will not be able to tell you immediately what will be the modus operandi.
So if I'm allowed to make a comment, I mean,
sure.
I have covered the institutional sector for too long. So my surmise is that, this remains on paper. From a practical standpoint, getting privatization done for these 2 public sector banks, both from a process perspective as well as from an capitalization perspective, will remain on paper, unless it is the merger with the ICICI and all. There's no incremental value for those guys, for the other banks. So it'll be a very, very tough call how these will get privatized. I mean,
I agree, it's a very tough call. I agree, it's a very tough call, but my reading is, frankly speaking, the government having announced will ensure it is done, because they would not like that after announcing this that they don't go ahead with it. That's what my reading is. But yes, it's a very tough call. It's a very politically sensitive call. It's going to be a lot of issues on this.
And historically, only new banks, have done very well, right? When they gave licenses on tap,
exactly.
Those are the banks which have, without any baggage.
Exactly.
So, anyway, thank you for your.
I said, no, because if you're going to take over a bank, you don't know what is going to be the skeleton in the cupboard.
Thank
so
you.
Everybody is going to be very hesitant on that.
Thank you.
I have a question coming from Mr. Desai. He says the Air India monetization failed to get response. So what is your confidence level that this time government will make it happen?
Yeah, the 2 things. See, earlier monetization did not take place much, for the simple reason is that we were not interested in completely selling off the assets. Today,
Yeah.
the government has decided that, except in LIC, they are only going to offload a few percentage of share. LIC, they are not going to sell the entire asset. But the two public sector banks and one insurance company, they have decided to completely sell it. And other like BPCL or IOCL or other organizations, they're only planning to divest some of their holdings. It is not that they're going to sell the entire asset. They're not going to completely privatize it. So I think this time, see, last time if you see monetization of the asset is basically in case of Air India. Even today, Air India is going to be very difficult to be sold.
Yeah.
So it's going to be extremely difficult because even Jet Airways, which has been taken over, frankly speaking, the amount which is ultimately coming in is much less than what the bankers expected. I mean, the outstanding dues are much more than what the ultimately they are giving the offer, only 20 to 25%. So I agree that monetization will not be able to fetch that kind of an income. But at the same time, holding on to it also is not going to generate that kind of an income for the government. So at least it is better that they divest 5%, 10%, whatever they are planning to divest, so that at least that kind of a funding comes into the country for them to use it for better utilization of their infrastructure and better opportunities which they will be having to use the funds.
Okay. So the mode of execution of this is very important. How you
Very important. Yeah.
So NPA is the one area where we had a lot of issues for so many years. It looks like by bringing in a solution of the bad bank, perhaps there is a way out of this NPA issues that we've had for so long. Do you think that even this monetization of assets should be done with some corporate body or some quasi-corporate body which will have a focus on just that, instead of just leaving to the government?
But again, see, corporate body also which you create, see, it depends on, every asset which you're going to monetize will be in a different sphere.
Yeah.
So you can't have one body which will be interested in getting a monetization of a power industry or a road industry or a banking industry or an insurance industry. So it is going to be very difficult. It has to be completely given on the floor of the house. Whoever wants to buy it should be permitted to buy it. If you start forming another, frankly speaking, bad bank you have taken up, but I am not for it even today. What is going to be the ultimate benefit of a bad bank, God only knows. I mean, though some of the bankers are gung-ho that it is going to, generate a lot of capital for them and all that, but actually, if you really work out the nitty-gritty, no capital is going to come to them. It is just that you are going to remove the things from your godown and put it in another godown in which you are going to hold some share.
But it's a proven product in Malaysia, right?
India is not Malaysia. You've already had enough ARCs. You already have enough ARCs. So why do you need a bad bank? That's going to be another ARC. You have enough ARCs. So you might as well sell it to that respective ARCs only. Why do you need another ARC which will be formed by the 9 banks? I mean, 9 people, 11 people are going to form it, I think, with each one holding a 9% share as of today. But ultimately, what is going to be the benefit, I think we'll come to know in the long run. But I personally am not for it. And quite a few people whom I've spoken to it are also not for it, because you really work out the mathematics. If you ask Mr. Harish also, he'll tell you the same thing. You work out the mathematics, it is not going to gain anything for the banks overall.
Okay, we'll see. We have spoken to quite a few people, and they're saying, great things about that bank, that this is going to solve the NPA. So there is
that is one of the reasons the market went up. The market went up because of that, because there's a lot of expectations on that.
Well, let's see. I think time will tell us. Ma'am, do you think there is a level playing field for fair competition between the PSB and private sector banks? Well, you already mentioned that things like the social investment that the public sector banks, the private doesn't have to do. So that's a little unfair there. If not, what should be done so that PSBs were with their private sector equivalents?
See, absolutely there is no fair play. Absolutely there's no fair play, because I have worked in a public sector bank, I have worked in a private sector bank. 2-3 things I'll tell you, major thing. One, as I told you, is the human resources. A private sector bank does not, right from the top you take. the State Bank of India chairman, one of the most powerful chairmen, you just see what is his pay scale and what is the pay scale of a private MD. It's heaven and earth difference. Okay, now let's forget the MD level or the ED levels or the general managers level. Even in the mid-level, in a public sector bank, you do not have the right, just if a person is even absolutely competent, you cannot give him an additional increment or you cannot give him an additional promotion. He is the same run of the mill, whether he performs or doesn't perform, he has to go for the same interview. Whereas these kind of a thing, the government has to remove this anomaly. The private public sector should also be able to recruit people of their choice by paying a higher scale, by paying a higher value for human resources. If I have to retain the best talent, today talent is a real scarce commodity. So if I have to retain a talent or if I have to bring in fresh talent, the public sector bank should have the leverage and the liberty to choose of their own without any restriction from anyone, number one. Number two, public sector banks again should be given the freedom to decide whether they want to do a particular kind of lending or not. It should not be forced upon them. Three, many people will call it as a bogey, but it is not a bogey because even the finance minister keeps on saying that don't be afraid of the CVO or don't be afraid of the CVC. Why do they keep saying this again and again? If there was no bogey, that means there is a pressure on the public sector people who take decisions. And if the decision goes wrong, they are held accountable. People at that time do not realize that the person who had taken a decision, right or wrong, I'm not talking of 1% or 2% or 3%. This is across all the public sector banks. And that is why even about a couple of months back when Madam Honorable Finance Minister was talking, she said, work without any fear of the CVO or the CVC. Why do they keep saying this? That means there is still that feeling in the public mind, in the employee's mind. So all these things are not really a level playing field for the public sector. You have to remove these kind of problems which come with that. Third, give the liberty to the bank's board to decide what should be the way forward for that particular bank. It should not be by what is decided by the government that you should do only in this, you have to do this advance, or this you have to do the advance, or this is the deposit, or that is the deposit. I think like a private sector bank, give the liberty to them. Because if you see, the private sector bank has only one control, the Reserve Bank of India.
Yes.
Public sector banks have the Government of India as well as the Reserve Bank. So we have dual control here, a single control. So there is absolutely no level playing field. I think now with this privatization, I think the government will also realize that we have to give more freedom to the public sector banks if they have to be made viable. Because ultimately the aspect is what? That every organization has to be viable, has to stand on its own feet without any government. And government in those big banks also, other public sector banks, should start reducing their, the stake.
Okay. Okay, I have an observation from Mr. Prabhakar Kaza, who was the head of a public sector bank in London. He says, France has several state-owned banks and public sector enterprises. Government should lose control.
Can you please repeat? Can you repeat?
Okay, can you hear me now? Hello?
Yeah.
Can you hear me? Yeah, okay. So there's some connectivity issues from my side. I'm so sorry about it. So his observation is France has several state-owned banks and public sector enterprises. No reason why Indian government should lose control. More so when the private sector has not been, respectable enough for compliance and regulations. That's his observation. It's not a question. You have any comments to make on that?
Yeah, as I said, there are black sheep in the private sector.
Yes.
If not, if you see, that is why when I had come for an earlier speech, I said corporate should not be allowed to take over the banks. I agree with that observation. The government should reduce their stake and bring it to less than 50%,
Mhm.
but they should not completely come out of it, because the private sector is not that, they are angels and the public sectors are devils. No, both have devils and angel nature, both mixed.
Correct.
It's up to the individual how they perform.
So
So
we have
we
to look
need public sector. That's why I said next 100 years also we'll have public sector banks, public sector insurance companies, public sector enterprises.
okay. So another quick, so PSBs, ma'am, are weighing. Let's look at technology, okay? Because that's very important. Because without technology, just in this world, nothing moves, right? The efficiency of an organization is depending on the adoption of technology. So PSBs perhaps are weighing, heavily under the legacy technology that they have been having. To replace it means a lot of money, okay, which slows down the business agility and does not give them a fair chance to drive perhaps disruptive growth or be in line with what the private enterprise and other banks are. Should government lay down a technology infrastructure fund to overall the technology strategy of PSBs?
I have a different take on this, Mr. KK, because if you see in the last few years, all the public sector banks have invested heavily in the technology. In fact, most of them, if you see, they're either in the Finacle 10 or in the latest versions of this. The private sector banks, yes, they have the advantage in the sense they are digitally, they have the caliber and the competence to attract more business. That's lacking in the public sector banks. It's not that the infrastructure is not there. I think all the public sector banks have invested very heavily in the last few years, and especially in the last 3 to 4 years after the Nirav Modi fraud. I think including SWIFT, everything, all banks have invested so much that, and every now and then Reserve Bank also comes out with some guidelines that this has to be on the system, this has to be on the system. So I think, frankly speaking, everybody is well invested in the technology, is well invested in the infrastructure, but the utilization aspect, yes, I would agree there that the private sector banks are able to utilize their digital products, they're able to use their infrastructure, I mean the technological infrastructure much more than a public sector. This is basically the reason is that their team is more aware of it, number one. Number two, the private sector banks, they target the youngsters who are also more tech savvy. Vis-a-vis the public sector banks, if you see that most of them, their customers will be 45 plus average age. Whereas for a private sector, the customer age must be 30s. So these are the basic differences. Yes, in some banks, of course, I agree, maybe the small, weaker banks, which we are talking of, the 5 to 6 banks which are there, government may have to invest in the technology, in the infrastructure and the technology in order to make it digitally more competitive, because today the digitalization and the technological importance is what is going to really help a bank to reach its targets. Manual system is completely outdated.
Okay. So are you aware of any banks, public sector banks, looking at aggressive technologies? Are you aware of looking at AI, RPG?
Everyone. I think everyone has got AI today. If you see your anti-money laundering system in all the banks, it is based on AI. And in fact, if you see your SWIFT, it is completely integrated with the software. All your guarantees, all your letters of credit, all your core banking, everything is only through your technology. Nothing is done. Nobody can physically even enter a thing. But AI, I agree, we are not using it. The public sector is not using it like a private sector, like using it as a chat bot or using it for, garnering more customers. Yes, that is where the public sector, as you say, we are lacking in using these kind of a chat bot and those kind of, vendor integration. There, yes, public sector bank have still not gotten the system of, using these artificial intelligence as well as the technological innovations to, garner the supply chain management, the vendor managements. Yes, there I agree with you. The but that will not cost so much as the training, I think. The training is more important for a public sector person.
Oh, okay, great. I have a very interesting observation that has come from Santosh. He says, ma'am, the core banking systems which the public sector banks have got, it's already an old and obsolete and legacy system. Now, we cannot bring that in par in today's technology. And so he says that needs to be overall anyway. So we cannot.
I agree with what he says. Any technology goes outdated within 2 to 3 years.
Yes.
I think the maximum amount which any bank, whether it's a public sector or the private sector, has to provide is for upgradation every year or every 2 years. I mean, I fully agree with him that today the core banking of Finacle or whatever it is, FlexCube or whatever it is outdated. But
yes,
as and when a new system comes, every bank has to update. There's no doubt on that. And major
hello?
Mr. KK, I think you're frozen.
Yeah, okay. I'm back.
Yeah.
Okay, great. Sorry. There is today there's a little bit of problem.
No problem. No issues.
So another query that has come in, there are discussions underway for railways to tap its dedicated freight corridor,
right?
Like AI's airports to tier 2 and tier 3 cities to be monetized. How will these measures benefit the economy?
See, these measures will definitely benefit the economy for the simple reason, once you have a dedicated freight corridor, like I think from Ludhiana to Dankuni and various other places which they're doing, I think it will be a huge number, will help the country earn a lot of revenue, number one. Number two, your products can be much faster dispatched. The timelines will be, the time will be saved. Based on the time which you're saving, your products are going to be fresher. Even, a small product like your daily use products can be transported in such a fast manner that the freshness of the product, the quality of the product, everything remains intact by the time you go there. Similarly, when you go for the airports, today, if you see the customs in the airport, especially they have done a study that the airport in Bangalore, the customs are able to process the shipment within 24 hours vis-a-vis a shipment which is taking place in a northern state, which takes 4 days. So these are the things which help an exporter also to generate his income faster. Because if my shipment goes faster, I am able to get the money from the importer abroad much faster.
Yes.
Whereas my shipment is delayed here itself. And there are chances then the goods getting spoiled in transit.
Yeah.
So I think dedicated freight corridor, specific centers for these customs in the airports, in the ports, seaports, all these things will definitely help the economy of the country, because the swifter turnover, the better product, and the ease of doing business. Ultimately, all this go into ease of doing business, which will improve our ranking in the international world also.
True, absolutely. Yeah. I read today that there are 2 railway stations, one Gandhinagar and one some other station away in the north. They are going to be made look like a world-class airport, international airport.
Sure.
It's a big change that's coming. So the way we look at it, great. Ma'am, will labor laws come in the way of this mega thought of privatization?
Labor laws have to be simplified, because with due respects to the Haryana government, with due respects to them, they have brought in a new labor law saying that 75% of the people should be local. I mean, see, it may make a lot of political sense, but it makes very little economic sense.
Right.
Because on one hand, we are saying that with China having problems internationally, we want many of the people to come to India, to invest in India, and we want to open the doors to them, number one. Number two, Many of the software companies and many of the other industries today, because of the pandemic, are even able to have people work from home.
Yeah.
So if you restrict and say that it should only be a local person, or it should only be this particular caste, creed, community, see, merit is the one which has to take a role in any kind of a job.
Yeah.
Only thing is, nobody is saying that you trample upon a person and make him work from morning 6 till night 12 o'clock. No.
Yeah.
No labor law says that. But you have to give the flexibility to the promoter or to the person who's setting up a unit, that he should be able to, because see, first and foremost, if I'm setting up a unit X place, I would prefer naturally the local persons, because it's easier. I don't have to provide accommodation for him. I don't have to provide transportation for him. So for normally for all the unskilled and even skilled job, if I'm able to get locally, any industrialist would prefer from the local person. He normally recruits from outside only if he feels he is not able to get the relevant technical skilled person. Otherwise, there should be no reason why he should not take. But if you bring it as a rule that you have to have this many people, or you'll beyond 4 o'clock, if you work, you'll have to pay him double the overtime, or you will have to have a union which will say that my people will not work on Sundays, my people will not work on these days. I don't think our country can come up. So there has to be labor reforms. And in fact, in one of the webinars which I was listening to, one of the person was saying, unfortunately in our country, we have the inspectors come and say, okay, that this is not there, that is not there, this is not there. So we need to actually implement, I think remove all the old labor laws and make the fresh laws which will be beneficial to the workers. I'm not saying it should not be beneficial to the workers, but keeping in mind the overall economy of the country, keeping in mind what is really good for the country, not for an individual or not for a particular political party or not for a particular state. We have to overhaul the entire labor laws.
Absolutely. Great. So, ma'am, we are past the 5 o'clock and we have to wind up today's session. Thank you very much. Is there anything in summary you would like to tell our audience?
I would like to tell the audience that let's take the Prime Minister and the Finance Minister, and let's hope that we do. In fact, in one of the United Nations, he had said that sabka saath, sabka vikas. So it has to be we do the progress, taking the people along, and we ensure that our country remains number one in the world. We have to reach that. Whether I'm not only talking about the 5 trillion economy, and as he said in one more place, which is very true, when he was talking the privatization, that wealth creation has to be done. Only thing is, unless the wealth is created, we cannot distribute that wealth also. Only thing is, we have to ensure that the distribution is not lopsided.
Yes, very true. Thank you. Thank you, ma'am. So, ladies and gentlemen, we would like to wind up this. Just a brief one-liner from me. As of now, much of the public assets in India have been lying idle or barren, unutilized. So by monetizing them, and they will be utilized for creation of productive assets, like Madam said, creation of wealth and setting up of factories leading to economic development. I think that could be a game changer if monetization of assets are well managed and well executed. So let's see the interesting days coming ahead. Thank you, ma'am, for coming and spending time with us.
Thank you, Mr. KK and the entire team of EPS for having me on show today.
Thank you very much, and a happy Women's Day to you. That's coming up on Monday.
Sure.
So, ladies and gentlemen, a special announcement. We are coming up with a special panel discussion focusing on women, deliberated by women. FinTech payment women specialist will join the panel discussion moderated by a FinTech expert. The topic is building a gender inclusive financial system for rural sector. So, ladies and gentlemen, this will be a very interesting discussion. Please join in on Wednesday at 4 p.m., which is our scheduled time. And we'll look forward to seeing all of you. Till then, goodbye and have a great weekend. Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you.